This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it. We're back in the dark room, Art of Darkness. I'm Kevin Kautzman, joined by Brad Kelly. Brad, how are you? Fresh off our Mary Shelley episode.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I've been thinking about that ever since. I'm totally Frankenstein pilled. So I'm going to have to reckon with that. I got to fit that into my reading schedule somehow. It was great, Kevin.
Yeah. On Valentine's, don't say be my Valentine, say be my Frankenstein.
Oh.
And we're party on, Brad. And we're joined in the dark room by man of letters and fellow podcaster, friend of the pod, Matt Pegas. Matt, how are you?
Doing well. Thank you guys so much for having me on.
Of course. Who are we going to talk about on this dark room? We do core episodes. Mary Shelley's episode last night, 4 or 5 hours on Shelley, and we rather famously did 6-7 hours on the subject that we're going to talk about with our guest here today, Matt. Matt, who do you want to talk about on today's dark room?
Well, it is December 1st, and on the anniversary of his death, we will be talking about Aleister Crowley.
The Beast 666.
I just felt the chill. I felt a cold chill pass through the room. I mean, that might have been an HVAC situation here, but
you live in Detroit, Brad. You're in a basement, aren't you?
Yeah. I'm in a haunted basement in Detroit, so this is perfect.
It's a yes and thing. Well, and so for people who don't know you, Matt, tell people a little bit about yourself, where they can find you, where they can find the New Right podcast, and then we're going to dig in to Crowley. I've got some ideas for the After Dark that we always do for Patreon. We're going to do a reading, the annual tarot reading for Art of Darkness.
Oh, excellent.
We're going to do like an online Thoth tarot reading. Brad's going to read because that's what he does. And Matt, I know you're interested in tarot too, correct?
Yep, got it right here. So
brilliant.
Yeah, Matt is more than interested. Matt is
Matt is a tarot.
If someone in the audience is interested, they should seek Matt's Substack out. Read his writing.
Oh, thank you, Brad.
Yeah, he does an excellent job.
Yeah. Brad's the one who got me into tarot, though, as I've said. So I did do a pretty deep dive on it, especially this year, and we'll talk about that. But I think Brad, you've been at it for longer, so I think we both bring our expertise. Yeah,
mutual appreciation society, I suppose. But yeah, you're doing a great thing there. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit as well.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah. So Kevin,
tell us about yourself, man. I want to give us the big picture for the audience, for people who don't know you, Matt.
So I'm a, very online writer like the two of you. I wrote a novel called Dragon Day, which came out with Terror House Press 2.5 years ago now. I have a Substack where I've kind of written shorter fiction more recently. It's called I call my blog Strange Flows on Substack. I'll get the actual URL. I should have that down pat the way you guys do to pitch on the show. Let me pull that up. But I also, a lot of your listeners will probably know me as one half of New Right podcast with Dan Baltic. And that
the show's lawyer. Dan Baltic is his Art of Darkness's lawyer.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. The online right Twitter's favorite lawyer.
Yeah, that's right.
But New Right is kind of
the funniest lawyer in America.
Absolutely. New Right's sort of a companion pod to Art of Darkness in a way. We're definitely, mutual appreciation society, like Brad said. I think we started at a similar time, and I love what you guys do. I think it's one of the most amazing like themed podcasts out there. But what we do is kind of downstream of that. It's less digging into the darkness behind art per se, but we certainly get up to plenty of that. Ours is more of a general literary podcast, I suppose you'd say. My Substack URL, because I just pulled it up, is mattp969.substack.com. You can find me on Twitter at MPEGS, that's MPEGZ696. That's my @. I could go on promoting these various things. So actually, maybe this is something I should work on in the new year. I have my hand in a lot of different things. One half a New Right Pod, got my own blog, whatever. I kind of also have this other people. I think some people find this confusing, but it's actually relevant to today's topic, so I'll bring it up. I have another podcast I do that I call Strange Flows, which is also what I call my blog. And that is similar to New Right. We've even done some episodes that are sort of both, but that's a solo podcast of mine. And I say it's relevant to today's topic. It's not as active as New Right. I kind of post more sporadically, but it's relevant to today's topic because the intention there was to be more focused on esotericism as well as art, but yeah, definitely esotericism and tarot and those kinds of topics are what I'm doing a lot of podcasts on about there. So I think that probably gives enough background information on me.
Right on. Yeah, definitely check out these two podcasts, New Right and Strange Flows.
Yes, cool. And you can find all that kind of through my Twitter feed and all the rest.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it. So when we have these darkroom episodes, the guest comes on because they want to talk about the subject. It's been a while since I thought very deeply about Aleister Crowley. I dredged my books up, including a couple of the more obscure volumes that I have, Secret Agent 666, and then this Aleister Crowley, The Beast in Berlin, Art, Sex, and Magic in the Weimar Republic. I have that too.
Oh,
yeah. Okay. Depending on how the main episode goes here, I might dip into this, or I might save some of it for the After Dark. But when he first arrived in Berlin, there were like newspaper articles about him. He was a figure like that, pretty early. He was notable.
Right.
Very much like, although he was a few generations later, he was 3/4 of a century later, very much like Mary Shelley and her little gang, where Lord Byron, people, almost like the paparazzi. There were no cameras, but people would just linger outside of his house to get a view of him, and he's like Mick Jagger, but just a poet, and Crowley had some of that juice. So I guess Matt, I'll ask you, why do you want to talk about Crowley? When did you first get interested in him? Let's go into my background. That's this first chunk of the notes I sent you. I just kind of started free writing, and it seemed like the reasonable place to start would be just talking about my background with the guy, because it's kind of long and a gradual development of interest. I think like a lot of people, I found him first through music as quite a young person, as like a 13, 14-year-old. I was a huge Marilyn Manson fan as a teenager, so I think that's probably where I got a lot of it. But also like David Bowie has some references, and of course the one Ozzy Osbourne song. That's kind of where I first came across his name. Zeppelin was giga. Jimmy
I forgot to even mention that. Of course, yeah.
He bought his house.
Right. Yeah. The what's it called?
Boleskine.
The Boleskine house. Yes.
Yeah.
So kind of as just a rock and roll fan, had always been aware. I kind of have my own, as I think probably a lot of people on this corner of the internet do. I personally was brought up Catholic, and then I was like, an atheist,
The one true faith,
liberal, in high school. So but would go back and forth a lot. So my kind of relationship,
the church is waiting for you with open arms, my friend.
I know it.
Mother Church is yearning for you to come back to her.
Yeah. Well, hey, I didn't say I left definitively, but it's one of these things that's complicated for many of us, I suppose.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm closer to it now than I was, when I was first listening to Manson and getting into Crowley. I say that I give all this background, kind of, because in college I went back to the church and attended regularly. So I think, again, like a lot of people on this side of the internet, I've sort of vacillated between different things, and within that, it's like, oh, is Crowley something that should be avoided at all costs, or is he great? Is he someone to aspire to? This kind of thing. Like I've kind of, from around the time I heard of Crowley to about 5-ish years ago. I would kind of go back and forth between those extremes a little bit. I always found him interesting, and I would maintain, and I will, kind of argue for this today, that he's not. I certainly don't think he's like a Satan worshiper in any real sense. So even from a more conservative or Christian standpoint, at risk of sounding demonic to people, like I'm trying to butter people up to hear the word of the devil or something. I don't think he's quite as bad as a lot of people think, even from that perspective. But we can get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of read him as a bit of a cautionary tale. I think that it's essential to understand him if you want to understand the water that we swim in now. It's Crowley's world. We just live in it. The contemporary popular culture is Crowleyan. It's not Catholic.
Absolutely.
And so it's helpful to know that, so you can process things a little better.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to totally divert. I was going to go more into my background with him, yada yada. But I do think what you say now could branch off to two topics we could talk about a bit. One of them being, is it Crowley's world we're living in? Because I view him. This is like a central thesis of kind of the notes I took and my general take on Crowley. I really think he's quite similar to Friedrich Nietzsche in his sort of general outlook. I mean, Nietzsche maybe would have dismissed him as being totally hokey. Like, I'm not trying to, for Nietzsche respecters out there, I'm not trying to make too false of an equivalence. Obviously, there's some silly things about Crowley that wouldn't quite apply to Nietzsche, but the basic response to the, quote unquote, death of God and this sort of thing, I view him as working in that tradition. And within that, I think there's kind of an open question of like, yes, the broader culture is Crowleyan in the same way that it's very Nietzschean. But does that necessarily mean Crowley, would give the total thumbs up to all of modernity? Probably not, I think. I think there's a something to be delved into, to what extent are these people like Nietzsche, like Crowley, sort of predicting the way the world was already going and trying to, find a place for philosophy or spirituality in the case of Crowley within that, and to what extent did they sort of will it into being? I don't know. I think
both men were obsessed with will, and of course it's Schopenhauer as well, who we're going to cover next year, which should be an interesting episode. Crowley pops up everywhere. Have you seen The Killer yet?
I have not seen it yet, unfortunately.
First, and this is not a spoiler, but in the first 5 minutes, he says, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law."
Oh, really?
Oh, well, that makes me want to see it even more.
Yeah. So, it's right there. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So I think, I hope we will get into that today a little bit. Like, to what extent is there value in that, and to what extent is it, extremely dangerous to kind of promote that on a mainstream level? Like, I mean, I'll go veering from Crowley for a moment, because it's easy to look at Crowley's followers and progeny in the world today. It's pretty easy to dismiss almost all of them. But
Well,
Nietzsche,
it's like a fandom.
it is like a fandom.
Yeah.
It can get very Reddit there. And there are some very serious Thelemites and Crowleyans who I would not want to piss off either.
Right. There's that. I don't know. Where are the good Thelemites? I don't know. But to bracket Crowley for a moment, because I do really view him as in this Nietzschean tradition. I think with Nietzsche is a much more illustrative case of someone where there's like some of the worst intellectuals, not necessarily for being unintelligent, but some of the intellectuals with whom I disagree the most, and some of them who I agree the most, are very Nietzschean. And I kind of think a similar thing can have with Crowley when you're emphasizing, the will so much, when you're emphasizing kind of thinking through the crisis of modernity. And, I'll say the death of God, obviously, as I don't think I need to explain to you, but as the general, just to kind of give it a caveat for the general audience, most people, when they talk about Nietzsche's concept of the death of God, don't necessarily, like, you could, as many Christians have, kind of acknowledge that Nietzsche pointed to a real problem of modern nihilism without necessarily agreeing that God is dead in any real sense. Right. There's people who take insights from people like Nietzsche and, work with it in a Christian or obviously very conservative context. And, I would argue that the same thing could be done with a lot of Crowley's insights and takes on things. Admittedly, we don't see that very much because I do think he attracts a really bad element.
Yeah.
The other thing, go on. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say there's something kind of interesting. I mean, both of those guys have been used toward sort of propagandistic ends by various parties, right? For different reasons. And so that always kind of taints things. If you're trying to get a 3-sentence summary of the person, well, in Crowley's case, you're going to probably say he was once called the most hated man, and the most hated man in the world,
the wickedest man in the world,
the wickedest man in the world, right? And so that automatically kind of puts most people's hackles up. And Nietzsche was bastardized and used by the National Socialists to some degree, right? So there is something about that, but then both of them are sort of. I was trying to think about how to phrase this because what I was reaching for at first was like poetic. And I guess what I mean by that is they're using enough sort of figurative language that you can take out individual pieces of it and use them to make any argument you want.
I think that's largely true.
Yes.
And that's an issue with them in large part.
I would say it's potentially even more of a problem for Crowley. Because even though he was writing in English, his entire system is syncretic. He'll say, roll a die, write down 6 religions on a sheet of paper, roll a die, and whatever you come up with, practice that religion for a month. How do you deal with that from like any sort of objective, rigorous, philosophical, like what do you do with that? It almost kind of predicts Wittgenstein, where he makes it a game. Wittgenstein, he talks about language games. It's all games, and Crowley's idea is sort of like, well, if it's a game, let's hack it. Let's learn how to break the game. And that's magic. And then of course he also had I beg your pardon, Matt. They both had a wicked sense of humor. Nietzsche,
absolutely. I do think the risk is sort of greater with Crowley than Nietzsche. Well, it depends on.
And he was also probably more prolific. I think Crowley was just a scriptomaniac. He just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote.
Yeah. Although, and I don't even know if this is that relevant of a point. I would say Nietzsche was a significantly better writer than Crowley. I don't think Crowley's a bad writer, but Nietzsche is one of the greats, and Crowley is a decent writer.
Crowley is a bad writer, man.
Certainly, I've never tried reading his fiction.
I got it.
I think that when at his most lucid, he could be a good writer, but he was someone who was perpetually sort of non-lucid and sort of distracted, perhaps. Not even to delve too far into that, but Nietzsche's a much better writer. So even though I do think he's been used and abused, there's kind of a more clear truth there that shines through, whereas Crowley remains, I think, more up for interpretation in my opinion. The other thing I was going to say, and again, not to uphold one Art of Darkness subject at the expense of another, but in terms of this issue of whether or not he was the wickedest man in the world, shall we say, compared to the last not After Dark, compared to the last Dark Room episode I participated in, I would say that Crowley is. I'm actually very curious for your guys' take on this. He's almost a saint compared to Burroughs.
Yeah,
maybe I'm overstating it. It always strikes me like
I think I'm actually working on the we're gonna do a real Burroughs episode. Burroughs was the first subject we ever covered, and we just did not give it the amount of time. So first episode of season 4 is going to be the full Burroughs episode. And as I'm going through it, and I've always had to reckon with this for my appreciation with him as a writer, and he was a son of a bitch, right?
No, and just the
wreckage and abusing people and the sexual indiscretions, all of that. And Crowley is I would tend to agree with you.
Yeah, it's like say your piece, Kevin. Sorry.
Yeah, the major difference between the two, and Brad's going to be doing the full Burroughs in January, because of course it was our first episode. We didn't know what we were doing. It was only an hour. So I expect a long banger episode at the beginning of 2024 from Brad. He's got the Burroughs book right there. So look forward to that, friends. But, and maybe my notion of this will change after that episode. But my impression is, like, with Crowley, you kind of got what you ordered. Like,
right.
If you were sucked into his orbit, you kind of had no excuse. In a way, I mean, he advertised what it was, I think, pretty clearly.
I think so too.
Yeah, Burroughs, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure Burroughs' wife signed up to get shot in the head.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And in terms of the kind of cultier elements of Crowley, I'm also reminded, and I'm not an expert on this topic, but it seems like he's a little more straightforward than like the L. Ron Hubbards of the world too. I mean, again, I'm not trying to pay too much PR for the guy, and I did listen to all of your 5-6 hour episode on Crowley, which I enjoyed a lot. It's a lot of it's kind of mild compared to like the worst people, in my opinion. Like, he was a little bit culty, definitely. He was obviously a sexual degenerate, but he wasn't like a pedophile the way Burroughs was. It kind of seems like one of the worst things in his biography is the whole like Himalayan mountaineering incident. Since you guys did the episode, I haven't re-listened to it. Remind me. I mean, that's kind of the big thing was a certain carelessness almost. I don't know. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brett.
Well, I was just going to say my interpretation of that. I mean, Kevin put that together. My interpretation of that was, it was. I mean, it's more of you chalk it up to a mistake, partially due to kind of bravado, but certainly no malice. It wasn't a malicious thing, right? It was more on the order of an accident or a mistake. So,
I mean, I think one of the worst things that happened at the Abbey of Thelema in Italy. I'm going to read from the Wikipedia to refresh your memory here.
Yeah, please.
It was a small house which was used as a temple and spiritual center in Cefalù in Sicily in 1920. The villa is still there today. Kenneth Anger, who we should probably do an episode on, Brad. That might have to be. Yeah, and rest in peace, Kenneth Anger, or wherever, rest however you want, I suppose. Rest as you will shall be the whole of the law.
Yeah.
That would be a good like kind of a core episode for the for Patreon only, Brad. I might have to think about that. Anyway, filmmaker Kenneth Anger, he filmed some of the murals that were there, but in any case, some stuff happened. And it was Raoul Loveday died at the Abbey. His wife, Betty May, blamed the death on his participation in one of Crowley's rituals, allegedly incorporating the consumption of the blood of a sacrificed cat, or the more probable diagnosis of acute enteric fever contracted by drinking from a mountain spring. So what happened? We don't know. Did Crowley have this young Oxford undergraduate drink the blood of a cat? It's not confirmed. Apparently Crowley had warned the couple against drinking the water. And but she came back to London. She gave an interview to the Sunday Express, a tabloid, which had her story in it. So I don't know. I really don't know.
Right.
I mean, Mussolini kicked him out of the country.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know. I think there's a story too of some fornication with a goat. But again, like, these things are sort of shrouded in, like, is it true? Is it, was it stuff that like his enemies said? I don't know. In any case. Yeah.
Yeah.
There you
It's
go.
just a little, I think there's a little bit more room for reasonable doubt than there is for a lot of, again, the kind of the worst examples of people like Crowley who are worse. And I don't know. I'm not trying to do too much PR, but I think that he was, the wickedest man in the world. It's a little bit more in like a Marilyn Manson sense, or even like a Rolling Stone sense. He was kind of more this rock star figure, is sort of how I view him. And I definitely don't view him as like an ideal role model in any sense. But I think a lot of the issues have to do with kind of a certain scatteredness, I guess, of what do I mean by that? I don't know. It just seems like, I want to talk today about, the quote unquote real meaning of "do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Yeah. It seems like, kind of Crowley had, he has some artistic feats, certainly, the Thoth tarot deck being maybe the best example. But other times I think he falls victim to even beyond like the question of like what is of things that are like overtly evil. The other issue with telling people to do it, to do what thou wilt, essentially, is that you get people who, the human spirit, and we'll get a little philosophical here, a little spiritual too. The human spirit, sometimes you can, I believe, and I don't think this is, I think what I'm about to say, I think, is very much in dialogue with what even, above board Christians might say. The human spirit is such that you can order your soul in a way that following, what you will, what you want, can be identical, with God's will, shall we say, and you end up doing things. If you kind of order yourself in that way, I think doing what you want can be a wonderful, wonderful thing. And certainly, anytime you're making art, you're kind of following that inner drive. But more often than not, when the modus operandi is do what thou wilt, the lesser parts of the soul, to kind of wax a little Platonic about it, are going to take over. And then that's how Crowley obviously is a drug addict, right. Does all kinds of sexual things that probably didn't bear much fruit, shall we say. Right. Right. I just think he's an interesting case of both. I think to a certain extent, definitely, I imagine you guys agree that because you did an episode on him as, an artist, he kind of exhibits some of the good parts of like an antinomian, follow your will spirit, and some of the bad parts as well. And my contention, I bring up those other people like Burroughs and perhaps Hubbard in a different way. I bring it up because where he fell short and tripped up and did things that were ugly or just otherwise contemptible, there's some of it's shrouded in mystery as to what actually went down, and other times it's just, and even the thing with the goat, I certainly condemn bestiality, but it's like, it sounds kind of just like something that a weirdo would do if they really were high on their own supply.
It sounds made up. I mean,
it does sound kind of made up. Yeah.
One thing that I've learned,
I don't know. I went. Hey, listen. I went to Google right now. I just looked up Crowley goat sex, and the number one thing that comes up is this is yourmagic.com. Sex, drugs, and the Abbey. Inside Aleister Crowley's occult, blah blah. Well, Leah was out in Sicily stooping goats with Crowley. Her sister Alma had fallen into the clutches of another wayward guru. People love this stuff.
Yeah,
people eat this stuff up.
Salacious.
Yeah, I mean, So I mean, who knows about it? Yeah, of course. Obviously, you condemn that. I mean, it's just beyond. It's totally beyond the pale. But again, what do we really know? I mean,
Matt, I want to. I feel like there's more to say here about this full phrase. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, right? Because I'm going to let you, but the one thing I'm kind of want to tee up, it's like, that is, now that I think about it, that is quite a famous sentence, like as a piece of, I mean, almost everybody knows that, right?
Even if they don't know kind of where it came from. People are familiar.
Yeah, it rings a little bell. They probably heard it on a metal album or something, right? So, Yeah. So
Go on.
what is your take on what that means, or maybe not even your take? What's Crowley's take on it?
Yeah, well, yeah, I would like to get into that. I have one of the better books of Crowley's is Magic Without Tears, and he has some sections in that I sent to you guys before, and I'll kind of go on to review mode in a second and get into that. But beforehand, I agree. It is a very, very famous phrase, and I think that's some of where Crowley's genius and some of where the upshot of some of this occult / magic stuff comes in, even for people who aren't necessarily, even for people who would want to avoid it because it seems evil, and even for people who think it's all nonsense. There's something to the sort of, it's like sigil magic and like bringing things. It looks like meme. Which is of course related to meme magic as well. Bringing things down to their sort of core components, whether as a meme or a little catchy phrase. I do think that phrase, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," is kind of one of Crowley's genius inventions, because it is a really bite-sized, kind of gets stuck in your brain, almost like a pop song that he was able to release on Culture for better or worse. And again, to go back to the Nietzsche thing, as Nietzsche's the better writer, and I guess Nietzsche's little mind virus pop phrase thing would be "God is dead," I guess, because that sticks with people. But the "do what thou wilt" thing, to me, sort of, it's like a little, it's like pop Nietzsche in a way, I guess. Which again, for better or worse, I think he kind of brought some of those ideas forward in a way where they could be transmitted through rock music, etc. Again, for better or worse in terms of its effects, but there is something there to be learned from, I think. But to get into it, obviously the I'd say it's like the midwit or silly interpretation, but let's be honest, it's also the most natural interpretation of "do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Is just do whatever you want, man.
Right.
Is
That's
the
right.
yeah not
That's
is the yeah. Go on, Kevin. Sorry.
Yeah.
no. I mean, that's part of the joke. I mean, he knows
Yeah.
what he's doing.
Yeah.
If you're a moron, or if you're not illumined to the mysteries, to the Crowleyan ideas, you're going to think it just means carte blanche, anarchy, libertarianism, do whatever you want, and that's going to lead you straight to hell. And Crowley, and literally hell on earth, you're going to have problems. Yeah. I mean, you know who does what they want at all times? A toddler. And a toddler, if they were left to their own devices, what did you said something funny, Brad? Because of course, I'm busy raising kids when I'm not doing the Art of Darkness podcast. But Brad, didn't one of your friends say having a toddler is like having a clown that's always trying to kill itself?
Yeah.
I mean, it's so true. I mean, these kids will just run in the street. But of course, the real meaning and the real idea, from Crowley is that you have to discover your true will.
Right.
Every man and every woman is a star. Every star has its own true will. When perfectly orbiting in the orbit of their true will, no star will collide into one another. The work is really to find your true will, and then do what thou wilt. And of course, one more thing I have to say before passing this over, Matt, is that it's not just Nietzsche. It's Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
And we have to go back to Schopenhauer, who was released The World is Will and Representation in 1818, which is the same year that Frankenstein came out, coincidentally, from the Mary Shelley episode. Yeah. And of course, his whole idea is that, I'm just going to read from his Wikipedia, and we're not going to go too far into Schopenhauer, but his idea is that he characterizes the phenomenal world, the world of phenomena, the things we see and hear and taste and smell, as the manifestation of a blind and rational noumenal will. So, these 19th century thinkers, they were, at the beginning of the century, all the way through the end of the century, they were thinking about will literally as like the thing that drives everything. And Crowley definitely picked up on that and carried it forward and made it poppier, like you say.
Yeah. One thing I'll add that I actually like about Nietzsche and Crowley, as opposed to Schopenhauer, personally, and I actually think in a weird way, this becomes more amenable to religions like Christianity. I know it's very ironic to say in the case of Crowley, maybe less so in the case of Nietzsche, is I think, yes, Nietzsche, Crowley, Schopenhauer, all, Nietzsche learned from Schopenhauer, Crowley references both of them. They're kind of talking about the same thing as the world as will, but I do think this take is fundamentally different. I'm not quite a Schopenhauer expert, but I know enough to know that he was essentially like a Buddhist and a very sort of pessimistic type of Buddhist by the end of his life. He very much viewed it as like, this is the way reality is, and your best bet in the face of it is various forms of sort of stoicism, I guess is the word, or asceticism even, sort of stepping back and dealing with it, because like the will, it's this unpleasant thing that ultimate, it's sound and fury signifying nothing is kind of Schopenhauer's take. Maybe you've read more and disagree, but I view Nietzsche and Crowley as being in a process of seeing that and somehow trying to circumvent the nihilism of that, kind of affirm the world as will, and draw something good from that.
This is interesting in some of the other material you sent, and so a lot of that I was reading for the first time. So I'm not that deeply read on Crowley material beyond his tarot deck. The schools of black, yellow, and white magic.
Yes,
it feels like. So is this? I'm not trying to sidetrack too much, but like it sounds like under the model that Crowley was laying out for what these schools, the sort of attitude that these schools have, Schopenhauer would be not black magic when we think of like evil, right? But the black school of magic, and Crowley, maybe surprisingly to some people, is actually sort of trying to be at least in the white school of magic.
That's how he understood himself. And he does differentiate, he's not really talking about white magic and black magic is popularly understood.
Right.
Although of note, he says that black magic is popularly understood as like an excessive school within what he calls the white school of magic with which he identifies. And he does, again, what I kind of mentioned earlier, like he doesn't worship Satan in any open way per se. He doesn't identify with practicing black magic per se. Yeah, he identifies with this, what he calls the white school of magic. And I don't think I do want to get back to Do What Thou Wilt shall be the whole of the law and what it really means in a second, but it's actually all tied in. Like we'll get to all of this by talking about this. Yes, he explicitly identifies Schopenhauer with what he calls the black school, which is essentially metaphysical pessimism. He really actually paints I think he paints with too broad of a brush what he considers this pessimistic black school, because he says Schopenhauer is like a very cogent, lucid expression of it. But he also, of course, says that Buddhism is part of it. And then in a way that I maybe disagree with more, he says like pretty much all of Christianity and Judaism is also ultimately within this pessimistic school. Because, and I think with Nietzsche and Crowley both. Yeah, original sin. He actually talks about, I don't want to get too in the weeds on this yet, I guess, but he sort of talks about how, the act of Christ dying on the cross and rising from the dead would be more in line with what he considers his white school of magic. It's this sort of salvation for, or turning the sorrow of the material realm into joy. So he actually recognizes that as what he calls like a white magic ritual. But his argument is that, Christianity is sort of mired in pessimism, and a sort of denial of the drives and this sort of thing, kind of similar to what some of Nietzsche's gripe with Christianity was. And I definitely think he goes too far in dismissing organized Christianity entirely, but I think a lot of people could see how he might have some grounds for criticism. There are maybe, we don't have to get into the theology of this, but there are probably branches of Christianity that are too, denying of sexuality and this kind of thing. I think that's sort of the back, and of course, as you guys well know, having done the episode on him, very similar to Nietzsche in this, he was kind of brought up with the form of Christianity, with basically bad parents, with a very stifling, sort of discipline-based version of Christianity. It's hard not to separate the autobiography from the ultimate, too great a dismissal of that, I think, in Crowley and Nietzsche's case. Both. But anyway, not to get too far in the weeds.
Yeah, but it's worth noting. I mean, they're both sort of sons of pastors, right? Wasn't Nietzsche's father? Yeah. So admired in this sort of, I don't know so much about Nietzsche as much as I know about Crowley. I will do Nietzsche eventually. I've read most of Nietzsche's work, but the biography I'm a little thin on. But I assume a Protestant pastor in Nietzsche's family, very similar to Crowley. And Crowley was part of like a Christian cult, like a super fringe, ultra evangelical kind of cult. Yeah. And so they're both responding to that. Crowley with a bit more humor. With a lot more humor.
With a bit more humor, but I do think that sort of colors the perception of Christianity on both of their parts, and cautiously, because I know Christians may be a little more open with regard to Nietzsche than they are with Crowley, and I'm not really suggesting that Christians read Crowley, but I do think there's something there. You could say that one could take some of Crowley's type of criticisms of Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity, even as it stood in England of his time, and there had been some divergence from the original sort of mysticism of Christianity, shall we say. I do think that's a process that a lot of organized religions are always engaged with. A lot of them do degrade. We see this happen. So cautiously, I would say, you could see in some of his love of mysticism, maybe there's something there, right? Like maybe on New Right, we did this episode. We didn't really get into this, but we did this episode with Justin Lee, who's an editor for First Things magazine, and we sort of talked about the concept of rewilding Christianity. Again, I think in the kind of post-Nietzsche world, there is, even within Christianity, like a recognition that there are issues of nihilism that slip in, like maybe in this Oswald Spengler type sense, Western civilization kind of losing its vigor. Maybe that's happened within organized religions too, and maybe that's what Crowley is kind of responding to.
There is a tendency, I think, for religions to try, to some degree, religious schools of thought, to some degree, try to sanitize themselves, especially as we get into the modern era. I'm not sure why. I've been listening to this lecture series on the Kabbalah, and I'm not going to talk about who it is or anything, but early on, he says, and it's very detailed and very good lecture series, but early on he says, now, this isn't mysticism. What I'm going to teach you is how to come into contact with the hidden forces of the universe. I'm like, okay, if that's not mysticism, then what is mysticism? Because if you tell me, and I think there's a lot of like trying to turn something into a science, or at least say it's a science, that ends up kind of shutting down anything that has the smell of irrationality around it.
Yes, and certainly, again, I'm a little out of my depth here. I'm not like a scholar of the history of Christianity, but I certainly think, and maybe this is my Catholic upbringing biased against Protestantism, but I definitely think there's, arguments against Protestantism that it tries to be too rational. Right. So, that would be where kind of Crowley and Nietzsche come from. But then even Catholicism, not trying to blaspheme, but this is related to that issue of rationalism a bit, but also maybe its own issues. You look at kind of modern churches being sort of mouthpieces for modern liberalism. Essentially, they, there is an argument to be made, and I guess part of what I'm trying to say here is, and I've written about this. Some of these occult type traditions, it's certainly dangerous, to be presented on a broad scale, but and as is sort of factually true when you look at some of the people who are saying this, there's a relationship between occultism, or at least mysticism, and actually traditionalism, with a capital T. And, figures like Julius Evola, who maybe isn't the best example because he wasn't a Christian, but even within sort of weirder Christian schools of traditionalism, you see that there is this tendency to kind of look back towards, an era of the religion that was more in touch with this kind of mysticism. I definitely even view like kind of going to Latin Mass and things like that as a version of this, even if, I'm not trying to break down meaningful divisions, but I think the same hunger that leads people to things like Crowley and other forms of mysticism is the same hunger that leads people to traditionalism, maybe to, going to Latin Mass, things like this. So I'm kind of interested in that problem more generally. Yeah.
Well, and Crowley was sort of doing it not necessarily within the line of Christianity. I mean, the thing that I was so stunned by when we did our episode, and then some of the stuff that you sent along as well, Matt, the syncretic quality of it. You sent
Yeah.
this, so there's a way in which, and same thing with the practice he suggested of sort of rolling the dice and picking a religion and being that for a month. There's something where he's trying to get down to like the perennial what Huxley would call the perennial philosophy, or
Right.
something. He's trying to get down into the, I hate computer analogies, but I apparently have a computer virus in my head. So he's trying to get down into like the source code or something, if there
Absolutely.
is
Yeah.
such a thing.
Yeah.
What tell us a little bit, just because I want to cover some of the stuff you sent. Tell us a little bit about this, the Tao of, what was it? What did he? It's a chapter in Magic Without Tears.
Right. He writes it's called the Tao. It's the
Tao,
chapter in Magic Without Tears. There's two parts to it. The first part's the one that I focus more on. And because you brought up, the three schools of magic chapter, the Taoism, the Chinese philosophy of that is what he considers to be the yellow school of magic, which in his reckoning is a sort of understanding of the functioning of the universe that doesn't kind of step into, this is my take on it anyways, doesn't step into his practice of like trying to use it more, I guess. Like it's like understanding the source code without trying to hack it. And basically what he says about the Tao is that almost, maybe this is a little bit too far, but almost like the Tao is the source code. Like the Chinese are right about this. Backing up a step, going back to Do What Thou Wilt. Basically, my read, and as far as Crowley explains this in the chapter on the Tao, is that the closest, he's a feaster at the buffet of all the world's religions. He's very syncretic, as you said. And it seems that kind of the closest, there's a lot of different pieces he likes. He loves the Kabbalah. He's one of the original Western practitioners of yoga. There's even things within Christianity, certainly alchemy. We'll get into all this. But the thing that he seems to identify the closest with Thelema, and the closest specifically with Do What Thou Wilt shall be the whole of the law, is the Tao. And this is another thing I want to say about the Do What Thou Wilt shall be the whole of the law phrase. There's a second part to it that people know less often. I'll just read it here. Full sentence is, Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, for thou hast no right but to do thy will. Do that, and no other shall say nay. For pure will, unassuaged of purpose, delivered from the lust of results, is in every way perfect. So from the get-go, I'll get back
I
to
love that. Delivered from the lust of results. And he's talking, he considers this an art. And this is a great way to handle artistic practice. Don't worry about whether you're going to get published or not. Just do it. Just write
no, completely. I mean, I very much, and this was a little bit, we don't have to get in the weeds of this, but in terms of my background on Crowley, I kind of started talking about how like I was into him, a little unsure. When I started really getting into him, like 5 years ago, I will always go back to like, I don't know, this stuff is dangerous in a certain sense. And like, some of it is maybe nonsense, but I do think it informs the creative process really well. And I will stand by that. Even tarot to an extent, like I don't know about, the truth value of all the divinations one can do with tarot, but certainly playing with these elements as presented by the tarot can really inform the creative process. I think we'll talk more about that later. But I just think that brings up a really interesting point, that kind of, even if Crowley is, sort of overextends some of these nuggets of truth he finds, I really will stand by that this stuff is useful to think about as an artist, because maybe this is the argument, maybe there's an element within occultism, within Crowley specifically, that he's trying to make you your own god, and like, maybe that's really blasphemous. But hey, as an artist, even if you do so with great reverence for the real God, you are in that position of being, the prime mover unmoved a little bit, right? I mean, you don't have to look at it that way, but it's like you're kind of stepping into that. So whether one should play God in their whole life, maybe not, but certainly there are contexts, and I think the artistic process is one of them where this stuff can be really useful. But to unpack the Do What Thou Wilt thing, the thou hast no right but to do what thy will. I think my take on that, it's meant to be as binding as it is liberating. It's very much meant to be something, that you do the legwork for, and then you let it rip, not just let it rip without doing the legwork. And what is that legwork? I don't know if Crowley in his practice in his life always defined it super well. As I said earlier, I think he's very much, very, very human and flawed in the way these things come out, obviously doing what thou wilt and can end in drug addiction, etc. But at the very least, in Magic Without Tears and elsewhere, we see that he does have an idea of the stuff you're supposed, and very much, of course, has an idea of the stuff you're supposed to do to prepare yourself to follow this path. And it's kind of intense work on the soul. And in his case, he very much ties it into Taoism. And I'm not the expert on Tao, but I think a lot of us have some idea of this. Of course, the most famous quote about Taoism is, the Tao that shall be named is not the eternal Tao.
Yeah.
It's this. I suppose I'm probably going to bastardize this a bit, but the Tao is, the Tao is this like eternal nothingness energy or something that's kind of behind all life. It's analogous to concepts like chi and this kind of thing. And I think that it's obviously gets very hard to talk about, notoriously, once you start to categorize it within the very teaching of the Tao, you're already straying from the path. But I think the best way to understand what the results of having the Tao with you, so to speak, are that it's basically a flow state. In short, there's a lot of throat clearing to get to that, but basically the Taoist high point, from what I can tell, is that you're in this kind of flow state where it's all about the process. It's not about the results. And that ties into that other part of the quote, for pure will, unassuaged of purpose, delivered of lust from the results, is in every way perfect. What doing what thou wilt is supposed to feel like, in Crowley's view, is this flow state that, you get into it as an artist, perhaps, or even working like a normie job of, when you're in that flow state, I think we could all experience it, in our lives. And it really does feel like sort of everything in that moment is in some way perfect, right? And you are following some, almost like, I don't know if it's predestined or what, but you're following some path that just everything about it feels right.
Mm-hmm.
And that is,
it's probably the closest that an average person ever gets to something like enlightenment. And you only get it for a very brief, some number of minutes generally, right? But there is something about like the question of, it's a weird space where the question of what I should be doing or whether I should be doing this or not doesn't even like enter into it. It's somehow outside of all of that.
Yeah. And it's like, oftentimes any athlete will tell you this, oftentimes when you're in that state, you're doing your best work, but it also doesn't matter. You're not really thinking about the product. It's just happening. That in short is what Crowley's talking about. I love this quote from that chapter that I think it shows you something about Crowley's personality. As is well known, he was a rock climber, and this is sort of on a detail within that concept of flow state, I guess, rather than the flow state proper. But he kind of talks about how, when you're in that state, you don't make big adjustments. You're just kind of going with it. And I like this kind of connection between him and his spiritual beliefs and his athleticism. He talks about rock climbing. I'll just read the quote. He says, "When I used to climb rocks, I never jumped, I never grabbed, I never made a sudden or violent movement. Therefore, with thin, smooth arms like a young girl's and legs tough enough, it is true, but always slow and steady, I used to find myself at the top of pitches that had beaten all the gymnasts." So, I mean, that doesn't substantially expound upon the kind of this flow state as I'm already defining it, but I do like how he is able to, because, so much of Crowley's writing is about pretty mystical stuff, but there's kind of a more example from his day-to-day life of getting into that state.
It's funny too, if you go like into like, self-help, self-improvement territories on YouTube or whatever about flow state, rock climbing is usually like one of the first activities that they will use as an analogy, because it takes some skill. It's a little bit dangerous. You kind of don't know how it's going to go. You're always like, it's best when it's right at the edge of your skill, whether you can do it or not. It's like, has all of the physical qualities that might put one into that state. It's just interesting that Crowley, you think he may have learned more about magic rock climbing than we really might assume.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely part of how I read him. I know it's a question like how do you get from that to various sex magic practices? Again, I don't condone all of them, but there's something there. I think that the way to view him is, and I think you even Kevin when you did the pod, you even maybe I don't remember the exact quote, but you even said something to this effect. What he was really all about was finding, and this is what most of occultism is about, at least today. It's kind of hacking is kind of a violent way of putting it in a way, but he's kind of trying to hack into these elements of the human spirit through which we can find motivation, through which we can produce flow states. Obviously, I think the sex magic stuff comes in terms of, the erotic drive being one of the most powerful forces we come into contact with. And, maybe it really is a cautionary tale in terms of trying to tap into that to make other things happen in the external world. But that's where it's coming from. I think it's obviously I'm sure he was a horn dog. I'm sure he was
right. Yeah. We don't have to overthink
right.
it. I mean, he probably was just a horny goat. I mean, he was a mountain climbing horny dude
Right.
who grew up in a super repressed culture and religion and was having none of it. And probably also was sick of the hypocrisy because everybody else was doing all of this stuff too. So he just came out and he said the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I don't know. I think it's in an era where in a lot of ways, in a lot of ways, people are very sexually drained, I feel, whether it's because of porn addiction or lowering testosterone. There's kind of this weird thing going on culturally now where we're overexposed to pornography. It would seem things are hypersexual, but actually people are having less sex than ever. Again, cautionary. I'm not saying Crowley is the way to go, but you can kind of appreciate what he's, the sort of the degree to which he exalts sexuality is not necessarily a bad thing. I think there is, in an era where so many of us feel drained by various forces on the internet. The way that he exalts, like, in real life sexuality,
right.
I can sort of see what he's getting at, right?
Well, and this is a very good companion episode to the core episode we did just last night on Mary Shelley, because there's this idea, if you don't really understand, that by the turn of the 19th century, coming out of the 1700s into the 1800s, Shelley's parents were already talking about free love. They were already talking about the tyranny of the monopoly of marriage. They were doing it in with higher moral ideas than Crowley would. Like Crowley seems angry. Crowley seems snarky, and again, he uses a lot more wit than I get from Mary Shelley and her parents. But they were already talking about it. I mean, Mary Shelley's father created a huge scandal when he wrote a memoir quickly after Mary Shelley's mother passed, right after she gave birth to Mary Shelley. He wrote a memoir that was like a tell-all about his now deceased wife and the fact that her first child was to another man. And this caused this tremendous scandal. And this was a quarter of a century before Crowley, or 3/4 of a century before Crowley even came along. So it's not like Crowley just created himself and these ideas out of whole cloth. There was a counter movement that was already going on. It was not the mainstream, and certainly the conservatives were never on board with it, publicly, like the Tories or whatever. But and then Crowley also played the villain. He played the heel. He very much. He played the press, and fun figure, fascinating dude.
No, definitely. And in a lot of ways he is a progenitor of the free love movement, and we all can point to the bad effects that has had. But I think one can be very nuanced when they start to interrogate these kinds of things. The free love movement wasn't bad because of the sex per se. It's rather because of the kind of lack of structure, and then when you get the ruinous effect on family formation, and then when you get the internet, then all of a sudden people have their first and most sustained relationship is with pornography. that's where things really go off the rails. But from a starting point, like I am quite conservative in my views on sexuality. But I do think it's important to start from a place of like realizing that it is the stuff of life. Like it is obviously it's what produces life. It is this great and powerful force that really the shame of over liberalization with regard to it is the degree to which it's kind of been squandered. And
it ends up cheapening
It's cheapened.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's on purpose. Yeah, it's commercialized and cheapened and made transactional like everything else that they get their grubby hands on. Yeah.
Right. And where I don't know with Crowley is like, you mentioned, Kevin, like it's Crowley's world. We're just living in it. If he were alive today, would he view internet pornography as a good thing? Quite possibly not. I think for someone,
I think he wouldn't, but I don't know.
I don't know. It gets hard to unpack. It's just the reality of it is so evidently,
he might come around to that idea, but I think it's 6 months of Randy from South Park GIF for Crowley first.
I think something like that's
exhaust
probably
himself first.
Yeah. You were saying that.
Yeah. No. What was I saying? Give me a sec here.
Just that he would probably not appreciate the widespread internet pornography.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I don't think so. And like, I'm not going to pretend he was like a family values guy, kind of like Burroughs, kind of like a lot of these guys. I was flipping through Magic Without Tears the other day, and it's a section called The Family Public Enemy #1, which while I disagree with it, I did laugh because I'm so used to that sort of take from people like him. And again, he came from a less than happy family, so that's part of it.
He came from a less than happy family, which also I think left him with the equivalent of like $4 or $5 million that he burned through. So I mean, he's a mixed bag, Crowley, to me.
A mixed bag for sure. What I don't think though is that he viewed sexuality and raw sexual pleasure, the orgasm, as a total end in its own right. I mean, kind of manifestly he did, and he kind of believed it. From what I have read, and a lot of it's quite esoteric, of course, but is that he took the power of sexuality seriously. He, did he promote casual sex sort of by having a lot of it? Maybe, but I do think there's this greater reverence for the power that it can have. I mean, almost sex magic, say what you want about it, is inherently believing that it's kind of tapping into something higher and more spiritual. So I think, even maybe after 6 months of the Randy from South Park GIF, I think maybe there would be acknowledgement that, all that energy was going nowhere.
Right.
He is kind of like one of the sort of like Wilhelm Reich and Burroughs in his own way, kind of was a believer in the power of sexuality. And I think when you look at pornography, it is really deneutering everybody. And I kind of think he'd come to a point of view like that. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean his take on sexuality was good. I just think it's a little bit different than the total throwaway culture we have with regard to it now. I mean, I'm reminded of a joke that's both, I think you brought it up on your pod, it's both shocking, but also sort of insightful. He used to joke that he sacrificed children, which he never actually did, but what he actually meant was he was sacrificing potential children by masturbating every day. And as crass as that sounds, by acknowledging that this could have been a potential human, he was still at least connected to that. Everything in kind of modern sexual culture encourages us basically to completely separate the two. Crowley, I guess, was maybe doing it willfully and joking about it, but I don't know. Maybe I'm trying too hard to defend him like I was earlier.
No, not at all.
You see what I mean? He knew what he was doing, and I don't necessarily think his intention was pornographic. I think it was more it was magical. It was, using this for other means besides children, I guess.
Right. Well, we're coming up on the hour. One of the things I want to talk about on the After Dark for Patreon is Moonchild. I have it here, the novel that he wrote about this magical ritual. So we'll get a taste of some of his mediocre prose. his hack, self-aggrandizing prose. And then I have a few other things for the After Dark to kind of guide that conversation. Matt, I have a feeling we could go on for another 2 or 3 hours.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
In the interest of time, we're also gonna look at White Stains, his book of like weird erotic poetry. I'm going to read some of those poems. Then we're going to do the annual Art of Darkness tarot reading. Brad's going to do that. That's going to be a lot of fun. And then if we have time, I've also got a little bit about Crowley in Berlin, which will give us a little taste of how the media was kind of like writing about him whenever he'd pop into a new town. I have a feeling it may be tied into his like secret agent cover stuff. And he might have had a press agent too, for all we know. In any case, Brad, you were going to say?
Well, Before we sign out, there's one thing I kind of wanted to talk about in Matt's notes. But there's other stuff in here too. Maybe we'll do a follow-up Crowley episode.
I think we could.
Down the road, that'd be great. But you have a bit in your notes about the symbolism of the rosy cross, and this is something that has kind of come across my purview. You know, I've come across this from time to time, but I've never really understood it. What does Crowley have to say about the Rosy Cross? What does the Rosy Cross mean?
Yeah, no, this was one of the things that I found really exciting while reading Magic Without Tears. I'll answer it in two. I'll keep it brief because I know we're about to wrap. But to kind of go back to the black, yellow, and white schools of magic, I did want to read one other very quick quote from him that will end up tying right into the way he reads the Rosy Cross. Which, of note, he. That's blurred on the thing right now. Nope. He adopts the Rosy Cross as his own. That's what's on the back of the Thoth Tarot deck, and he kind of views it as the greatest sort of Western tradition. He's looking east a lot of the time, but he kind of views the Rosy Cross as the secret society that preserves something of the real spirituality he wants to get at within the West. But we sort of already talked about this, but I do think this is a succinct little quote on what he considers the white school of magic, what he considers to be his own school of magic, the type of magic that he wants Selma to be, the type of magic he wants to bring to the world, is this. He sums it up like this. If the black school of magic is everything is suffering, he says, the central idea of the white school is that, admitted that everything is sorrow for the profane, the initiate has the means to transform it to everything is joy. And this, of course, ties into alchemy in a spiritual sense as well. It's this notion that the type of ultra pessimistic world that Schopenhauer describes, that the Buddhists describe, it is a close to accurate picture of the way like kind of default, like life at its default is, but that the human being can sort of exalt it and transform it into something good through the power of will. And I find that idea very sympathetic. I think that I'm not.
It's kind of invigorating to me. It's
invigorating,
honestly.
and
it's like maybe you can do something about all this shit.
Exactly.
Like, at least inside, at least within yourself, right?
Yeah. And so he views the symbol of the Rosy Cross. Basically, it's the image of the stolid, barren cross, which. This used to be confusing for me when I was first getting interested in symbolism. The cross is, of course, a Christian symbol, and with Rosicrucianism, it definitely was purposely using a Christian symbol. But the cross does appear in other traditions as well. It's kind of one of those more broadly used symbols, I suppose.
It's been being used by tribes in the Americas since literally like 12,000 years ago. So it's I'm not trying to de-Christian it by saying that. I'm just saying, I'm partially saying it's not like he's not in this case, he's not necessarily blaspheming the cross, like saying the cross is barren and terrible on its own. It's Rosicrucianism in its own right is not like, traditionally it was sort of part and parcel of Christianity. Later schools within it probably were anti-Christian. But my real point is, the cross in the Rosy Cross, as he understands it, isn't necessarily the Christian cross. It's more of a general image of man, sort of in its default state, I suppose. Okay. And then, so the image is a rose, which is a symbol of flourishing and eros, being made to bloom on a barren cross. And the idea, and to what extent
the Rosicrucianism is shrouded in mystery. Like, do we know if this is what it actually was originally supposed to mean? I don't know, but certainly it was always an alchemical society. Certainly it was always about turning lower matters into higher, and that's basically his interpretation of the Rosy Cross. You know, a rose made to bloom on a barren cross, and that is the sort of raison d'etre of the white school of magic, is to initiate people into this ability to turn everything is sorrow to everything is joy.
Well, all right. Well, I think we've turned a little
That's
bit
a great
of
place
sorrow
to
into
stop.
joy.
Matt and Pegas,
yeah.
where could, hopefully we have. And we're going to come back on the After Dark. We'll do another 20 or 30 minutes. Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. I've already talked about what we do. Thank you to the people who support the podcast. Thank you to guests like Matt. Thank you so much. I appreciate your insights into Crowley. You clearly are a deep thinker about him. You don't treat him like a comic book. So I really appreciate that. Appreciate that. Maybe next year around Crowleymas, we'll have you on and we'll think about some more stuff, because we could go into this exhaustively. We could do 5 Darkroom episodes just about like this book or whatever. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. One more time, where can people find you online? Just pitch your podcast real quick and then we'll come back.
Sure thing. It's MPEGS, MPEGZ 696 on Twitter. You can also find us, me and my co-host Dan Baldick at New Right Pod on Twitter. That's NEWWRITEPOD. If you follow those Twitters, the rest will follow. I got a link tree on there. I'm one half of New Right Pod, and I do my own stuff.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for coming on. During the break, try not to commit any sexual degeneracy that'll end up in your Wikipedia profiles, guys.
Well, I mean, wait, you said 5 minutes? I should be all right.
You're going to make it, Brett.
Awesome.